Art?
Just one more comment. When we're discussing the parking, a point was made by Dr. Merkel about the dimensions of parking lots. Eventually, you get to a tipping point when you start requiring vast parking lots that changes the character of the central business district. And so there's a fine line between provision of additional parking to mitigate the use and wrecking the character of the central business district. And trying to find that balance is a difficult issue. But I think should this go back and be remanded to the Board of Adjustment, that I would like to see them do a little, perhaps to inaccurately phrase it, but mixing apples and oranges, where you're looking at educational institution parking requirements versus the mixed-use parking requirements. And that kind of brings two completely different uses together. And I think that the Board of Adjustment needs to think which side of that divide do they want to be on, 57, or do they want to be on the 104? And keep those two separated and not intermingle them and try to do a calculus that involves retail, mixed use, and educational institutions at the same time.
So I want to get this straight, because to me it was just a little bit confusing what you said. Are you want to have business in one hand and educational in the other hand?
You have to decide which side of the fence you're going to go on and not do a calculus that involves both of them into the same calculation.
Your Honor.
Bill.
If I might just make a couple quick comments on the parking assessment. So the inventory of available parking and use of public parking was really intended just to be some information that the board could take into consideration. The basis of the mitigation was taking a look at common and typical uses that are allowed in the downtown in the central business district where no off-street parking is required, and looking at the applicant and requiring them to mitigate their disproportionate impact that exceeded that number. So it's exactly what the council did when the council considered the current location of NSA. They looked at the use of the building if it were for permitted uses of office and retail, and then they looked at the demand for the educational institution, and they required the mitigation of the difference between the two. And that's where the 42 parking spaces came in that case. So in order to kind of give an equitable treatment to the use that is the only use into the code that does not necessarily say that it has to provide parking, but that the city has to consider the impact upon public parking in consideration of the issuance of a conditional use permit, we felt that the most equitable way would be to make an assessment of parking demand for other uses that are not required to provide any parking downtown and to require them to mitigate the disproportionate use. The assessment of current utilization of public parking within 600 feet of the property was merely more informative. It was not the basis of the determination of what was going to be required to mitigate the impact. And so there are, while that information was available to the board, and the board certainly did consider it, and it was commented that it would be nice to have a count at noon, it was not the basis of the requirement of the mitigation at that time, at least not as staff presented it. We were looking at the mitigation of the disproportionate impact above and beyond uses by right that are not required to provide any parking, and requiring the mitigation of that additional impact.
A follow-up question on that, Bill. So if this was remanded back, as some have spoke about on parking, aren't we getting into the Board of Adjustment does not make decisions on parking assessments, if I'm correct? Who does that? They have to live within what they've got to work with. Am I correct on that? Well,
it'd be ultimately up to the board to make the decision about the information that's available before them and understanding whether they think the conditional use permit can be granted and whether the relevant criteria have been met and have been demonstrated by the applicant to be in conformance. So that is the board that has to make that determination, and we can certainly provide whatever information. And the board had the option to request additional information or studies from the applicant at the time of the hearing and chose not to do that.
And the Board of Adjustment found criteria 4 and criteria 7, as was discussed, as adequate.
As is documented in the reason statement in your packet this evening.
Okay.
One more, Mr. Mayor. Don't mean to be argumentative, but the other businesses up and down the central business district are tax-paying entities, and to an extent, they, through their property taxes, pay for the parking that goes on downtown. An educational institution is exempt from taxation, and therefore, perhaps what I'm suggesting is the board needs to contemplate a greater offset of the impact as a result of that, rather than incorporating an offset of the 104 spaces. And that's why I suggest separate, go one way or the other, but don't try to split the difference with calculations.
Well, in the testimony, too, that we received, there was no businesses downtown that disagreed with what they're trying to do because they're getting business. So that's something that this body needs to take into consideration as well. You separate that out. Yes.
If I might, generally taxable status is not a consideration in land use matters, and churches are allowed in the Central Business District by right, and there are a number of them that are tax-exempt institutions downtown. That's really not something that we can base mitigation upon the taxable status of an individual use. We really need to look at the impact of the use as a whole. We require reasonable mitigation, but to make a disparate decision on one entity, if you had a for-profit university, educational institution, and you had a nonprofit tax exempt, we really couldn't treat the two uses differently. We need to treat them the same.
So,
Okay, Catherine?
Was the first conditional use permit given in 2003?
The first conditional use permit was given in 2006 and then became permanent in 2008.
Okay, so then the code was updated in,
2005, I believe.
okay, so it just so happens that I also questioned the Central Business District definition, and it talks about that the commercial institution and educational institution quandary. I just happened to see this the same way as Art did when I was taking my notes, that was the conflict, and that's why the cumulative impact, which is criteria number 7, wasn't addressed completely. So I felt like that was why it needs to be remanded and sent back to the Board of Adjustment.
Sure. And if it's being remanded, so before a vote's taken on the motion, it would be helpful to have really clear instruction to the board. Mm-hmm. If it was that you wish them to develop additional information, what is that information you wish them to develop? Mm-hmm. Or if you wish them to reconsider, there's required they have specific instruction that's granted to them. So if you are remanding in whole or in part for look at one element or to obtain additional information, if it's the noontime count you'd like to see so that they have that information available to them, or if it's something else, it would be very helpful for the board to have very specific instruction about what it is the council wishes them to reconsider, or what additional information that we as staff or the applicant need to develop and to be able to provide to the board for them to include that in the record and to consider it.
So does that require an amendment of the motion?
No, it doesn't require amendment. It just said we got to have
It's
Clear.
clarity.
If this is going to go back to Board of Adjustments, you need to be pretty, if you want to say, look, you need to do parking studies every hour on the hour, 3 times. The 9 to 2 doesn't work for you. You need one at 9 and 10 and noon and 2 or 4, whatever it may be. That's what they're going to need to know. That's how I understood what you just said, Bill?
That's correct, Your Honor. We would like to have precision in what is being requested of them.
And it would be a specific thing, not a broad array of things. If it's just on parking studies or traffic or whatever that would be, it has to be specific to what it would.
What underneath the preponderance of the evidence has been presented to the council that was not available at that time that should have been considered, and what is in the public interest to be developed on the record? Mm-hmm. That's what we need to have identified.
So my question is still, does that have to be part of the motion, those specifics?
I wasn't sure I had a clear understanding of what specific information the motion entailed. A restatement of the motion might be helpful to make sure we understand.
And we'll have Lori read it back to us. It had to deal with criteria 4 and 7. That's one of the problems we run into, and we talk a lot about stuff like this, but it's important to get. So, Lori, could you tell us what the motion was? No. You got no idea? Well, it was
recording. So, if you could restate the motion, that would be.
Yeah, I had moved to remand the appeal based on
number 1,
criteria.
appellate 1.
Yeah, appellate 1 based on criteria 4 and 7, which had to do with parking and the cumulative impact. The appellate talked about there was no data given, and you can't compare the educational use to the commercial use, and that there was a request for more information because of that to be sent back to the board. So it's in part.
So If I might, so
Yeah.
you're remanding it back, so when you look at criteria, those are the basis of the decision, that's not necessarily information. So if we're looking back at what information is necessary then in order to fully assess that criteria, staff did commingle the mixed use versus the educational institution on purpose to calculate the disproportionate impact of the parking that would be required to be mitigated, as was done by the council in 2006 in the current location. If this council wishes to impose a different standard of what they think that parking mitigation should be, then maybe that instruction, well, either you can modify that decision to modify that based on what you feel is appropriate at this time, or you can give them instruction to consider that. But I guess I'm still trying to get down to the new information that you're looking at trying to develop, and if it's the...
I understand. I'm sorry that I'm unclear because it's difficult to formulate, except because with reading with the minutes and stuff. So what the board member Long was asking, it actually has to do with more of what he was asking. So if we have to lay out particulars, and I can lay out particulars, I would like to see more studies done with the appellate's request. I felt like what was enumerated in her request about the different times and looking at the cumulative effect. So if we could go back to the appellate letter, maybe I could pull it from there.
Sure, that'd be great.